This event will last approximately 1 hour. The chat function on your screen is closed, but questions for the panel can be submitted either through the Q&A function on the Zoom screen or by emailing events@mei.edu for those who are watching on YouTube or MEI's website. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch online at mei.edu. We thank you for joining us today and hope that you'll check out our other events on our website. Our panel program is about ISIS in Iran and Afghanistan. ISIS calls itself in the region Islamic State of Khorasan Province, ISKP, or simply Islamic State, or even more simply is known as Daesh. We'll be exploring why and how it's of concern to Iran and its neighbors. Most importantly, because of the Islamic State's active presence in Afghanistan. We'll also be asking how it should be distinguished from the threat posed by Al-Qaeda and ways Iran and others can push back against both organizations. And we'll talk about much more. I have a set of questions of the panelists who will each speak for approximately 10 minutes. We'll also allow some dialogue among the panelists, after which, to round out our hour, we will go to your questions, and which can be raised at any time during the hour. We're pleased to have this morning 3 superb panelists for this topic: Fatima Amin, Javed Ahmed, and Alex Van Tanka. Fatima is going to be our first panelist, and she's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and has written on Iran, Afghanistan, and broader Middle East affairs for over 20 years. Fatima has advised the US government and non-government organizations on Iran's regional policies and was a TV writer, producer, anchor at the Voice of America. She was also a correspondent with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Fatima, could you set the stage for our discussion by addressing how big an issue presently is Islamic State, ISKP, for Afghanistan and specifically for Taliban rule? How might it become a greater threat in the future? Also, what is Iran's take on what is happening with Islamic State in Afghanistan? Please.
So thank you so much to the Middle East Institute. Thank you, Marvin and Alex, for organizing this really great and timely event. And Javed, it's very nice to meet you here. The event is really timely and is very important, although somehow overshadowed by other, tragic events in Iran right now. But let me get to the point, as for how big the threat of ISIS is, or how big the issue is, I would describe ISK as one of the most significant Taliban challenges. The ISK, along with major internal rifts within the Taliban, is the #1 reason for deteriorating the security situation in Afghanistan. More religious ethnic minorities are killed through bombings, explosions, and more violence now that the Taliban rule, and their inability to protect people. That is obviously a major challenge. And this threat, combined with the worsening economic situation, could gradually pull the country into a civil war. The Taliban is fighting on different fronts right now with Panjshiris, with ISK. It's facing internal rifts within the group. And, no country recognized the system. And they are also facing opposition from almost everyone, but including and most importantly by women. But it is really fascinating how the Taliban thought they would be able to end the violence in the country. Let me tell you a rather funny story. More than a year ago, shortly after the Taliban seized power in Kabul, I was in a BBC panel discussion whether the subject was whether the Taliban can bring security to the country. Other participants included Zabiullah Mujahid, Taliban's spokesperson. My argument was that as a new government, the Taliban might not gain any legitimacy and credibility if the horrible violence against the religious minorities and ethnic minorities go on, and especially against Shia Hazara. And he rebuffed by saying, oh, there was no way the violence could continue with the Taliban in power. We, meaning the Taliban, know them. He said, I think he also called me sister. We know every one of them. We know where they live. If something happened, that there is a good chance that we know who was behind it. We will arrest and punish them. So little he knew. So I mean, that underestimation, as I just told you, was really the illusion that they had, that they could, with foreigner out and coming to power, they would be able to restore security. But as I said, in addition to terrible condition imposed on women and girls by the Taliban regime, and the disaster, the violence against minorities, especially Shia Hazara, has dramatically increased since they came to power. But part of the challenge that Taliban is facing regarding ISK is, that more military personnel, I mean, if the reports are credible, more military personnel from the former government have joined ISK due to a terrible economic situation and the fact that they are out of jobs and other issues. And then there is the issue of disappointed Taliban members who have joined ISIS or are in the process of joining ISIS. This is not unprecedented. As you all know, in 2015, after a very heavy fighting in eastern country between Taliban and the other Taliban factions that joins ISK, the Mullah Akhtar Mansour, former Taliban leader, sent an open letter to al-Baghdadi saying there is room for only one flag and one leadership. And by the way, Iran supported the Taliban against that fight in 2015. That was in Farah province. So apparently the fight was over, some Taliban members complaining that the ISIS is gaining so much territories in Iraq and Syria, and they are not, unable to do anything in Afghanistan. The other issues they had differences over was the fact that over whether or not Mullah Omar, former Taliban supreme leader, was alive. So the major challenge, back to the challenge, is the security situation and Taliban's being incapable of, protecting the citizens. And but with the increasing financial challenges, there is a good chance that the Taliban would turn to Al-Qaeda-like groups with more financial resources. One reason al-Zawahiri in Kabul until recently might be, the reason they are looking for financial resources. But as for Iran, Iran is blind to the group's structure. Iran has some influences within the Taliban, but it can never compete with countries that traditionally have been supporting and allied with the Taliban, including Pakistan, even despite the differences over TTP that we hear these days, with the differences between the Taliban leadership and Pakistan government. They will always be closer to Pakistan than to a country like Iran. So Iran also has the fear that the Taliban could become a proxy of its rivals, which are more than one country. But let me also briefly talk about Iran's disadvantage, compared to other places. First of all, in places like Syria and Iraq, which hosts some of the holiest sites of the Shia religion, both the governments and Shia population welcomed Iran's forces to defend those sites, including, we all remember the pictures of Qasem Soleimani, not just in Iran, also among the religious believers in Iraq. That luxury Iran doesn't have in Afghanistan. There is no religious side in Afghanistan. The current government of Afghanistan or any previous government of Afghanistan didn't and doesn't want Iran forces. People don't want Iran forces. And with the Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun that I believe a lot of people exaggerate about, the fact is that Iran would not be able, maybe they would be able to deploy them in places like Syria, like Iraq, to fight in some holy places. But deploying them to Afghanistan, first of all, they are not necessarily Iran soldiers. And deploying them to Afghanistan is deploying Afghans in Afghanistan to fight Afghans. So ISIS folks are not ordinary and conventional army that you could recognize them. So basically it's just fight between all Afghans, and there is no use of Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun. They are extremely worried about a possible civil war in Afghanistan and the spillover into Iran. So that is the essence of their, attempt to fight ISIS in Afghanistan, or preventing the groups like ISIS-like groups to, infiltrate into Iran. And so, the other issues the challenges that they had before with transboundary waters, dispute over water between Iran and Afghanistan, drug trafficking, border clashes. If I get a chance, we will talk about that a little bit more these days with the Taliban forces. That is not going to go anywhere if, actually that's going to be definitely worse if there is a civil war in Afghanistan, if they couldn't resolve the dispute of, Hirman or Helmand water, when they would, form working groups between Iran and Afghanistan, with UNDP and other international organizations being involved to trying to help the differences. If they didn't go anywhere, if they didn't come to any result, there is no way that it would happen with the Taliban, or if there is a civil war in Afghanistan. I will end it here, but hopefully I will get a chance. I don't know how long I talked, but
no, you were fine. Thank you. Thank you. Let me just ask a quick question. How many people are we talking about in Islamic State, Khorasan? How large a group is this? of course, you could argue the kind of warfare that they pursue, you don't need large numbers.
Exactly.
But if you would just comment on that quickly.
Sure. I mean, I have heard different, really completely different numbers, from 10,000 to 50,000 to even more than that. But as you mentioned, I mean, for a army-like group like Islamic State, you don't need the rank, you don't need a central leadership, and that makes it more difficult to fight. So they are, trying to intimidate the society by really the unbelievable extent of violence, hidings, things that you don't need 100 people to do something like that, unlike Al-Qaeda that, their tactics. With Islamic State, even one is too much. If you remember the limited number of incidents in Iran until the one last year, there were not many people killed, but it was really scary, and it would kind of mobilize the all branches, factions of the government to just find and look for solutions and to resolve the issue. I mean, you don't need hundreds of them. One of them could do the job.
Right.
At any point.
Thank you, Fatou. We'll move on now to Javed Ahmed. Javed is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute and also a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. From 2020 to 21, Javed served as Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. Previously, he was a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at the U.S. Military Academy. He's worked as well at the Naval Postgraduate School and the German Marshall Fund. Javed, let me ask these questions briefly. What is Islamic State's agenda and messaging regarding Iran and Afghanistan? Because it's a regional issue, are there opportunities for cooperation against this terrorist organization? What about Pakistan's stance on Islamic State? What can be done to best counter the growth of Islamic State at the national and regional levels? Javed.
Thank you, Marvin. It's great to be here with you, Alex and Fatima. These are my somewhat unfiltered thoughts, of course, sort of in a rococo analysis with respect to how I see the emerging in this very troubling trend lines with respect to ISIS activities in Afghanistan, but also those that are directed at Iran in the broader region. And I think, unfortunately, it may not give you much clarity about the situation, but I may well increase your level of confusion. Let me make 2 points in response to your first question, that is ISIS agenda and messaging regarding Iran, but also Afghanistan. First would be on ISIS in Iran, and the second on ISIS and the Taliban. First, on ISIS in Iran, look, as an extreme Salafist group, as was mentioned by Fatima, ISIS's value proposition is not just principally anti-Shia and anti-minorities, but it's also uniquely anti-everything that does not represent ISIS itself. And I think they have increasingly made that very clear in their rivalry inside Afghanistan with the Taliban or other allied groups that are close to the Taliban. But as far as Iran is concerned, as a Shia majority country, it naturally tops the bill in ISIS's agenda. And so Iran today is confronted with a multi-front ISIS threat on almost every one of its borders, even though so far this threat has largely been a border or a tactical threat against Iran in Iran's own version of Shia Islamism. How I see this is that this is an encircled threat to Iran, which includes, on the one side, threats from ISIS's core on Iran's western frontier, western periphery in Iraq and Syria, to threats to Iran from ISIS's regional branches on Iran's eastern and southeastern borders with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and by extension also India, where ISIS now has a specific or dedicated province. And then also to Iran's north or northwest from ISIS's declared or undeclared branches in Turkey, Azerbaijan, and by extension from the Southern Caucasus, where ISIS has long operated through its own network called Emirate Kavkaz. So, and then on top of all of this kind of surrounded ISIS threat, there are also scores of anti-Shia groups in places like Pakistan, as well as unaffiliated fighters in the region who are either inspired by or they are tactically affiliated with ISIS, and they pose an increased a direct or indirect threat to Iran or Iran's internal security. But despite all of this, and I think what is quite interesting is that unlike other regional countries in that very turbulent region from Afghanistan to Bangladesh, where ISIS has a dedicated branch, ISIS at the moment has not yet declared a dedicated branch or a province for Iran. And so instead it has folded all Iran related activities, as you mentioned in your opening, under the Afghan branch or ISIS's Khorasan, which is also quite ironic because Khorasan or the Great Khorasan was the historical eastern province of the Persian Empire or the Iranian plateau back in the 5th or 6th century. And so regionally, the Greater Khorasan included parts that are today in northeastern Iran and northern or some western parts of Afghanistan, like Herat and Balkh, also southern Turkmenistan and in perhaps some parts of Uzbekistan as well. Iran had its largest province in the north called Khorasan, but until they administratively divided it in 2004 into northern Khorasan, southern Khorasan, and Razavi Khorasan. And interestingly, most of Iran's own ethnic and Sunni minorities, who would naturally be the natural prey to ISIS recruitment or ISIS's appeal, are also heavily concentrated in this kind of northern, southern, and Razavi Khorasan in Iran's north. And these include, folks from Kurds to Khorasani Turks to Turkmen, as well as Afghans and some Baloch and other Pakistanis. So the point here is that what's quite ironic is that for ISIS-K, which wants to bring back the original Khorasan, its natural location should have been Iran rather than inside Afghanistan. And I think, in fact, today, there's not even a self-proclaimed ISIS branch or network in Iran, but ISIS affiliates have gone to declare such networks in countries as far as Azerbaijan or in Southern Caucasus, as I mentioned. But what I also find fascinating is that, despite ISIS surrounding Iran from all sides, they have not yet succeeded in staging large-scale attacks inside Iran. I mean, I think the last known attack that was claimed by ISIS was in 2017 when they targeted the Iranian parliament in the mausoleum of the Ayatollah Khomeini. But the interesting thing here is that Iran consider ISIS in all its variants, Takfiri jihadists, in a terrorist group, and they have effectively equated them as the ideological sibling of Al-Qaeda. And so this too is quite ironic to me, considering the fact that Iranian state have hosted and continues to host senior Al-Qaeda leaders, another Salafist organization, including the most prominent one of the Al-Qaeda leaders, Saif al-Adil, who is at the moment a prime candidate to become the next Al-Qaeda emir to replace al-Zawahiri. And indeed, unlike other regional countries, domestically speaking, the internal audience and appeal inside Iran to ISIS's proposition or ISIS ideology is quite negligible. So the question here would be, are there no vulnerable individuals or communities inside Iran, particularly amongst Iran's Sunni population, that ISIS can appeal to? I looked up, and about 10% Alex would know infinitely more about this, about 10% of the Iranian population are Sunni Muslims. This includes, as I mentioned, Persians, Azeris, Arabs, Baloch, Kurds, and also folks from other Turkic tribes, as well as Afghans and Pakistani Pashtuns. So when you look at the age structure of Iran's population, you also have over 60% of them who are between the age of 15 and 54, 55. And that, naturally is basically the baseline the baseline and population structure that ISIS normally targets for recruitment and for other inspiration purposes. So what might explain ISIS's inability to appeal to vulnerable communities inside Iran, or what might explain their failure to do so? And I think perhaps, better border management on the Iranian side. They're very strong formal and informal intelligence in surveillance networks in that broader region, particularly surrounding its own borders. And on top of the fact that most Iranians were educated, with a good 2/3 of that population living in urban areas and largely urbanized. But on the contrary, however, at the height of the fight against ISIS, we also saw scores of Iranian Sunni Kurds and some other kind of Sunni elements within the Iran Sunni population reportedly traveling to different parts of the Middle East, Syria, and Iraq, and joining the fight against ISIS, mostly through Peshmerga and the Iraqi Kurdistan. But what's also interesting is that ISIS's own media messaging and anti-Iranian propaganda has been incredibly weak compared to other countries in the region. ISIS at the moment operates a very strong digital, a print as well as social media platforms from Afghanistan to its branches in India. And they are working hard to through those mediums to recruit, also to inspire attacks. But Iran is a visible missing link from this, even virtual media or print campaign as well. And the second point I wanted to make would be on the ISIS and the Taliban. The Taliban are juggling to resolve a fundamental dilemma between the three sides. On the one hand, they have their own very uncompromising clerical and security leadership. Then they have the newly realigned, this militant landscape, which includes ISIS. And then on the third side, you have the Mercurial Street, which involves extreme elements of both the Taliban rank and file, but also others who are product of that very dangerous environment that every single of the Salafist or non-Salafist groups are tapping into for recruitment and inspiration. And in between all of this, the Taliban regime has effectively become a one-stop shop for all things terrorism. They're making drug deals, effectively drug deals with many of these jihadist groups, establishing tactical partnerships, and at times even renegotiating their other relationships. And we saw it with al-Zawahiri's killing, and we'll see how that relationship also realigns. And in all of this, ISIS-K's role beneath the surface is rather unclear inside the country. ISIS considers, for example, the Taliban as opportunistic nationalists and not as pan-Islamists, despite the Taliban's own sympathy towards non-Afghan jihadists, including some within ISIS-K itself, which was formed as a rebranded Taliban, mostly from the Pakistani Taliban. But as a Salafi group at the moment, ISIS-K also have a problem with the Taliban's own version of imposing an exclusive Hanafi state. Now, traditional Salafism, as is observed in a place like Saudi Arabia, for example, they follow a very strict Hanbali version of Sunni Islam. But most Salafists in Afghanistan, minus groups like Al-Qaeda, even though they've also been, cultivated by the Taliban quite a bit, so they're very amenable to those practices as well. But the most Salafist groups in Afghanistan arguably dabble between the Hanafism or the Hanafi Islam and the Salafi Islam. And I think increasingly this includes members of ISIS-K as well, who, as I said, as members or as rebranded Taliban or as former members of the Pakistani Taliban, minus those who are foreign fighters, of course, they typically follow a very textual version of Hanafi Islam rather than Hanbali Islam. And the same goes for the Taliban members, even though they pride themselves as extreme Hanafis. But a growing number of them have now sort of spun off to embrace Salafist groups such as the Islamic State or even Al-Qaeda. So in essence, the presence of foreign fighters has not only wedded these kind of two competing ideologies, the Hanafism, Salafism, but it's also increasingly blurred the line between the two. We could hardly tell who's Salafi and who's a Hanafi in action. And so ISIS-K has generally avoided, for its own part, making those public pronouncements about their own Salafist credentials. Instead, they are working hard and they work hard to set themselves apart by targeting non-Sunni groups they consider as apostate, mainly the Shia community. And for its part, and it's been my last point, the Taliban has offered a very simple choice to ISIS-K followers inside Afghanistan. They've told them that either stay with ISIS-K, but you have to leave Islam, or you have to leave Islam, or you have to stay in Islam, but leave ISIS-K. And obviously, it hasn't, gotten that kind of attention on ISIS-K's part. But this Taliban approach too is very much filled with fatal contradictions, because the Taliban, on the one hand, are allied with an important Salafist groups, Al-Qaeda, but on the other hand, they're fighting against another Salafist group, ISIS-K. So it's really hard to kind of, reconcile that fatal contradiction as well. The last point is that ISIS approach at the moment is selectively confrontational towards the Taliban. The largest chunk of ISIS-K's foreign fighters comes from the Pakistani Taliban, with whom the Taliban or the Afghan Taliban are allied. I mean, in fact, they even negotiated or mediated negotiations between them and the Pakistani state. But then there are also defected members of the Taliban ranks. They're unaffiliated fighters, they're released prisoners, they're families of ISIS-K fighters, and there are also some displaced people across the regions that they have tapped into. But from the looks of it, the Taliban do not appear to have taken this ISIS-K threat seriously, even though they've gone after them and they've said we have a zero tolerance approach to ISIS-K, but they've largely underplayed it. In fact, they instead have gone after Salafist civilians in some parts of the country, like in eastern Kunar or Nangarhar provinces. So the second order effects of this Taliban approach have also increased the dangers of ISIS-K recruiting more from not just disgruntled Salafist population in Afghanistan, but also from anti-Taliban groups or even from within the Taliban's own ranks who are extreme or think like them. Going forward, I think we have not yet seen, unlike the Taliban, we have not yet seen visible frictions among ISIS-K ranks, and because ISIS-K is patiently realigning itself through these tactical partnerships with several Pakistani groups, Central Asian groups, I think eventually this changing ISIS threat will serve to bring ISIS in or Taliban and Al-Qaeda even closer. And I think that's something that we need to watch closely. I'll pause there. Thank
you. Thank you. Let's now go to our third panelist, Alex Ventenka. Alex is the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He specializes in Middle East regional security affairs with particular focus on Iran. Alex was formerly a senior analyst at Jane's Information Group in London. He's currently a senior fellow at Middle East Studies, in Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School at Hurlburt Field and teaches as an adjunct professor at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Alex, focusing on Iran, does Tehran have reason to be concerned about Islamic State? More broadly, what worries does Iran have about its Islamic extremism in general, Sunni extremism, presumably. Are these Iranians in the ranks of Islamic State? Are there Iranians in the ranks of Islamic State who are active in Iran? Are there differences in the way in which Al-Qaeda is viewed? Is it entirely about the attitudes towards Shia Muslims? Alex, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Marvin. Great to be with Fatemeh and with Javid and your good self, and really looking forward to the conversation. In the interest of time, Marvin, I'll try and be very brief so we can have some questions in from the audience. But before I start answering your good questions, Marvin, let me just give my condolences to the families of dozens of Iranian protesters who in recent days have been killed in Iran. It's really, as Fatima pointed out, a tragedy that's unfolding before our eyes, and we need to keep them in our thoughts. Look, Marvin, does Islamic Republic worry about ISIS or Islamic State in Khorasan? They do. And they say it plainly. They, in fact, formulate policy around it. I mean, I would argue that when the Iranian officials tell us that they reached out to the Taliban over the course of the last 10 years, less than a decade, one of the key motivations to work with Taliban was to recognize that at some point the United States was likely to leave, and the replacing authority would be the Taliban. And they worked with the Taliban, or they started the process of working with the Taliban, with one eye being on marginalizing, limiting, fighting jointly with the Taliban Islamic State. Over the course of the last 20 years, the Iranians have gone from viewing the likes of Taliban in Afghanistan as an existential threat to accepting a moderate, mellow version of the Taliban as a potential entity that they can work with against bigger threats. And today in Afghanistan, for Iran's purposes, from its perspective, nobody really is more threatening to Iranian interests than Islamic State. It's vehemently anti-Iran, it's vehemently anti-Shia, it's killing Hazaras whenever it gets an opportunity. It's a split from Iran's perspective in the Islamic Ummah, divides the Muslims along sectarian lines. I'll discuss Iran's own faults in being a sectarian entity later on if there is time. But the Iranians say this is, I mean, they like to, if you listen to Iranian messaging, the official messaging is that Islamic State Khorasan is essentially some foreign planted entity that is there to split the Muslims up. Again, if there is time, I'd like to discuss how this Iranian line is hard to believe, because Islamic State in itself has pursued since 1979 pretty much strong sectarian policies. I don't think anybody would question the fact that Sunnis in Iran do not have 100% rights as do the Shia majority. So Islamic Republic talking about Islamic State Khorasan being sectarian is kind of ironic, and takes me to a broader point, Marvin. We're talking about the threat of ISIS. We could look at it if you want to look at it sort of big picture point of view. There is the issue of civil war in Afghanistan. Obviously, if you're sitting in Iran and you already have 2-3 million Afghan refugees, some legal migrants, many illegal Afghans, illegal migrants who live in the country, the idea that next door in Afghanistan you'll have another civil war on a scale that Afghanistan saw in the 1980s, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Afghans moving into Iran, that is a security issue for the Iranians. They can't deal with it. They can't deal with their own population right now, Iran being sanctioned, the second most sanctioned country on earth today after Russia. The idea of hundreds of thousands of Afghans coming in is something obviously that concerns them. They don't have the resources to deal with it. And the other thing I would say about the situation in Afghanistan is Taliban was essentially, from Iran's point of view, an Afghan nationalist movement. We can dislike them as much as we like, but they were seen as an Afghan nationalist, at least part of their agenda. And all the relationship with Al-Qaeda and other international Islamists aside, but at the core, it was an Afghan movement. Islamic State Khorasan, with reports of senior members being non-Afghans, is, if you will, international jihad. right? And that, if I was sitting in Tehran, I certainly would ask the question, the fact that there are non-nationalists and more internationalists in their messaging, does that potentially mean they're going to have more success in recruiting among Iran's significant Sunni minority? Javid mentioned 10%, which is absolutely true. You do the numbers, we're talking just under 10 million people. Now, most of the handful, I shouldn't say handful, but in the hundreds of Iranian citizens who have joined Islamic State, certainly in the case of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, most of those came from the Sunni populations in Western Iran, in the Kurdish province. I should be careful because I don't want to give the impression to say Iranian Kurdish regions are fertile ground for ISIS recruitment. They're not. Their fact is much more secular minded, but they happen to be majority Sunni, and that has been an area where the Salafist radical militant Sunni organizations have been able to recruit. We do know small groups of Iranian Sunnis in the east, in the Khorasan regions. The 3 Khorasan provinces have also produced some recruits for ISIS, but again, we're talking handful of people. I mean, the most recent example of an act of violence by somebody who at least was allegedly sold to us publicly as someone affiliated with radical Sunni organizations was the young man who in April stabbed 3 clerics in the holy city of Mashhad, not far from the Afghan border. My point, Marvin, is the Iranians here right now, and I'll wrap up here because I really want to get the discussion going. They have obviously political security concerns. They will find partners in fighting Islamic State in Khorasan. Already relations with Tajikistan has taken a major turn in improving because Tajiks and Iranians and other governments in Central Asia have a common enemy here in Islamic State. Islamic State in Khorasan is an enemy for all of them, for the Russians, for the Chinese, and all of them. So this could create a reason for regional collaboration. It's early days, but Iran, as you know, joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization just a few weeks ago, formally, which creates maybe an opportunity for the Iranians to push that organization towards countering Islamic State. And if they do, I think many of the regional states in Central Asia want to play a role in that, because it's not just Iran that's going to get it. I think Javid pointed out that Islamic State Khorasan is against everybody. It's against Russia, it's against China, it's against all the Central Asian states. So here's an opportunity for collaboration against an extremely nasty organization that, as we've seen, kills indiscriminately. The other thing you have to remember, and this is a sort of a secondary issue, but Iran did do quite well economically Afghanistan, where the United States was there. Afghanistan had become a major economic zone of operation and profit for the Iranians. The Iranians are desperately trying to hang on to as much of that as they can, and ISIS or Islamic State in Khorasan blowing things up and creating instability is going to also hit the Iranians in their pocketbook, and I think that might be a factor, although, as I said, it's a secondary factor. But let me wrap up with this, Marvin. If you want to deal with a group like Islamic State in Khorasan and deal with its message and sectarianism and prevent recruitment among your Sunnis if you're sitting in Iran, then there's one thing you need to do, which is to listen to your own people, which is to reflect the aspiration of your people, which is not to pursue policies that are detached from what the Iranian people want. And then, we see the consequences of that right now in the streets of about 100 Iranian towns and cities where people are protesting. So if you don't want the likes of Islamic State from Afghanistan finding recruits in Iran, you better listen to your own, not just the Sunni minority in Iran, you better listen to all Iranian citizens who are clearly very dissatisfied with the state of affairs in their country. I think that's the best policy option. Someone like Ayatollah Khamenei, at the supreme leader, and the Revolutionary Guards who run the show in terms of Iran's regional activity, they have here. If they want to, because I think Javid said Iran doesn't have great insights into Islamic State Khorasan's activities, right? This is not the Northern Alliance of the 1990s when Qasem Soleimani shows up and tells his Afghan partners what to do. This is a different world we live in. So I think the Iranians should bank far more in terms of defending against the nasty Islamic State of Khorasan's message and ability to recruit in Iran, as opposed to try to shape events over there in Afghanistan, where today Iran is far less probably equipped to do than in the past. And I'll stop there, Marvin.
Thank you. Before we go to the questions, and I'd like to do that in just a moment, does our other two panelists, or in general, do you have any comments to make about something that's been said that you now would like to make a remark about? Yes, Fatima.
I would just, mention this or add to what Alex said so beautifully about the fighting ISIS. The solution would have been all these years to just provide the Sunni population in Iran with more rights and, just ease discrimination against them a little bit would have brought more security in Iran. The danger of ISIS, operations inside Iran is that it would result in more suspicious and more restrictions toward the Sunni population. That in turn would, just increase the resentment toward the central Shia-centric government in Iran, and that would become a vicious cycle. Unfortunately, they have not tried hard to just win the hearts of their Sunni population, as just Alex said it so beautifully. Yeah, there is really a solution somehow to slow down the extent of the ISIS sympathizing in Iran.
Yes.
Just quick. I couldn't agree more with Alex and Fatima. Look, inside Afghanistan, Iran's has had, it continues to have many problems with the Taliban. But, after they take over, they've also readjusted its own approach towards this new ruling regime, mainly because they fear that any support that Iran may or may not lend to anti-Taliban groups would then in turn weaken the Taliban's ability to fight ISIS. And that's, kind of the principal driver as to how they see that relationship. And the Taliban's own calculus with regional countries, including Iran, is that, to what degree they support these oppositions, whether they're Tajiks, Uzbeks, or Hazara political groups, like in the future, but also those groups who are not political groups, but military groups like the Fatimiyun brigades. And I think overall, when you look at it, regional countries are trying to kind of balance off their engagement with the Taliban by not just kind of tactically and bilaterally, but also seeing how they manage their own former traditional Afghan political allies. Iran advantage here is that with respect to ISIS, not just in Afghanistan, but also in the broader region, I would say this, which includes Pakistan as well, is that Iran isn't faced with any non-permissive environment across the region to go after ISIS. And I think it's mainly because Iran does not seem to have a supply chain problem when it comes to exploiting vulnerable communities and individuals, maybe not in Iran necessarily, not so overtly, but definitely across the region, including in Afghanistan, and from Fatimiyun to Zainabiyun to Haidariyun and others. And I think they're working hard to kind of leverage all those relationships that it has its own disposal to mitigate any risk.
Thank you. So let's now go to some of our questions. One of our questioners really brings in the United States into this picture and asks whether the U.S. can use violent Sunni groups to undermine Iran. What's your thinking about that? And if so, how would it do it?
If I may very quickly, I would say that's a terrible policy because, that is exactly the sort of thing the Ayatollahs, Ali Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards would want to see the United States do. The message then from Iran would be to its people, the Americans, the West, they don't care about you. They're looking to weaken you at any turn and opportunity. And they, by giving them that opportunity, what the United States will then do and be guilty of is to basically provide the Islamist ruling elite in Tehran with an excuse to hide the fact that people in Iran are upset about a long list of grievances that to do with the ideology of this regime in Tehran. But by and large, Iranians, and this is something that I think everyone knows, Iran, country of 5,000-year plus history as an imperial state, is home to many minorities, religious and ethnic. You got all sorts. I mean, we don't have time for us to get into it. We got all sorts of people. So the idea that you go in and you arm one group against another, and we've seen that. I mean, last time this happened was in '79, when a group of Kurdish militants rose up, and that was a ferocious crackdown, and the nation by and large supported it, even though they didn't like Khomeini. They liked the idea of Iran staying intact. Look, here's the key message, Marvin. Iranians, by and large, based on any data that we have, do not like the Islamic Republic. They want to see the Iranian regime go, right? But again, and this is not a scientific data, but by and large, Iranians love to live in Iran where the border is as it is, but much more representation for everybody, including religious minorities, including people who want to, for example, learn their in school in their own tongue, Sunnis and other religious Baha'i. My God, we haven't even talked about the Baha'is and Jews and Christians who suffer at the hands of the Islamic Republic. But all of these people have one thing in common. They don't want to see Iran go down the path of a bloody civil war where they end up fighting one another. They do want to see a transition to a much better Iran, but want to see that happen smoothly. And now the challenge for the leaders in Tehran is whether they can listen to their own people, or whether they think repression and cracking down is the only way forward, which in turn, again, is a vicious cycle. Then you invite people becoming radicalized, and we've seen that already in recent days.
You could probably broaden that statement, Alex, to say generally through the region, although there are large numbers, great portions of the population that want to see change, what they don't want to see is chaos. And that's certainly true in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So it really makes for a more difficult transition and requires, I think, a great deal more input than we've seen. We have a question here talking about Pakistan. Should Pakistan take a more aggressive role in regard to eliminating ISIS in Afghanistan? If yes, how would Pakistan go about it, specifically in partnership with the Taliban or others in doing this? What would be the ramifications?
I could take that.
Yeah.
Look, Pakistan's role is quite nebulous, and it's also inundated by or overshadowed by, Pakistan's usual kind of smoke and mirrors. I think, frankly, that country is already the Walmart of different variants of jihadist groups, and is also a ticking minefield, especially after the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. But ISIS-K's, Pakistan activities were negligible until 2019, when ISIS-K internally restructured. They established their own dedicated separate branch for Pakistan activities. They call it Vilayat Pakistan. And right now, Vilayat Pakistan is active mostly in Balochistan, but also in Sindh provinces. They've targeted, of course, the Pakistani Shia minority and other non-Muslim population, suicide attacks and others, including in March of this year in Peshawar that killed like dozens of people. The thing is, ISIS in Pakistan is also increasingly recruiting from Pakistan's growing extremist and anti-Shia population. And so by playing that card, it has found very important partners in Pakistan's own anti-Shia militant groups like Lashkar-e-Jangawi or Jamaat al-Dawa or even the LET. And I think there's a great deal of subcontracting or outsourcing of these kind of operational activities that's happening beneath the surface in these kind of new established tactical partnership. And in some cases, there are also now proxy groups that have their own proxies, and that's very interesting. On the broader level, I think Pakistan's failure is that it's not a religiously inclusive society. When extreme religious groups are mainstream, when militant groups are turned into political parties, and where any kind of blasphemy is politically weaponized and exploited, it obviously kind of fuels those kind of sectarian divides and creates that space for groups like ISIS to recruit from. Right now, roughly 80 to 85% of the Pakistani population are Sunni. If we talk about supporting a Sunni group, this is your Sunni group. And we have supported the Sunni groups in the past, and it hasn't produced any results. And they include all kinds of schools of thoughts: Deobandis, Salafis, Wahhabis, Brahmis, Sufis, and others. But beyond the religious sides, ISIS right now is openly engaging in recruitment drives in local schools and universities. Oftentimes in big cities like Punjab, there are recruitment overlaps between Pakistani army and jihadist groups, including ISIS. So the best thing the Pakistanis can do at this point, which they haven't done, is to basically start engaging in basic policing work, not counterterrorism, basic policing work internally, which they haven't done that yet.
Marvin, you're muted.
Sorry, we're running low on time. Let's see if we can get in one more question. The questioner asks, really, how does ISKP differ from those views of the caliphate set up in Iraq and Syria in 2014? I think many people don't understand those distinctions. So just quickly, thoughts on that? What's the difference between the ISIS that we recognize in Afghanistan and its origins in the ISIS that we associate with Iraq and Syria?
Oh, just very quickly, I mean, like that was ISIS core, and these are, basically their offshoots. With ISIS core severely degraded operationally, obviously they created these offshoots and some breakaway factions, and that's how they operate. But the locally or regionally, it has in fact grown ISIS's overall threat as opposed to degrading it, because ISIS threat has now largely transformed into an octopus. Its head was, of course, in ISIS core in Iraq and Syria. Right now, its head is in some ways in that broader South Asia, Western Asia region inside Afghanistan, but its tentacles are all over the region. So this octopus is, slowly growing. And I think it's critical to go after the tentacles as opposed to going after the head itself, because each of those tentacles have developed their own heads, and they're, movers and shakers there, like in the form of financiers, recruiters, logisticians, intelligence, and informant networks, among others. And I think so that's kind of the more widely the difference I see between.
Thank you, Joe. Well, we have some other questions, but it doesn't look like we have time to get to them. There are topics we obviously didn't cover. I know Alex mentioned that he had a good deal more he'd like to share with us. I don't think we perhaps made enough of a distinction between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Perhaps we should have spent some time on that, but that gives us an opportunity to plan for the future. Right now, I just want to thank our panelists for wonderful presentations. This was so informative. I hope that the viewing public agrees with me that this was at a level here of analysis which I think that we too infrequently are able to get our hands on. So I want to thank them, and and Middle East Institute for organizing this. And we hope to see you on another such panel in the future.